So in the next few videos, we're going to get in depth on the subject of flight planning for instrument flight rules. You'll find a lot of the skills you developed as a VFR private pilot are still being applied here, but the attention to detail is a little to much greater, and the nav log looks slightly different. Here's the big difference. In the IFR world, the flight plan you file may not be the same one as air traffic control actually assigns you. The technical term here is gives you a clearance, what I really mean to say. But it's still going to get you obviously to your destination. We're going to talk a little bit about how to research, plan, and file these flight plans, and then most importantly, how to deal with the last minute changes when air traffic control sends you a different way. So fuel exhaustion is a major cause of unscheduled off-airport landings, and fortunately, it's completely preventable. Just as the FARs dictate required fuel reserves for VFR flight, there are required reserves for IFR flight as well. In VFR conditions, in the daytime, in VFR flight, the FARs require you to land with 30 minutes of fuel in the reserve. So to my destination plus 30 minutes. At night, we increased it to 45 minutes. That's VFR. When we're flying IFR on an IFR flight plan, you should be prepared to divert to an alternate airport due to weather. Diverting means that you'll use more fuel than you originally planned for. So I'm going to show you what the FAR requires for fuel planning, and then I'm going to show you what I recommend as well. Let's start by looking at the FARs. Filing an alternate airport we know is always a good practice. It's like knowing where the restrooms are at when you take the kids to a park, right? An alternate airport means that if you can't make it to your main destination, you will fly to a second location. There are also times when filing an alternate, as we learned, is required by the FARs. We'll go into more details in the next lesson. I know we've covered it a little bit earlier as well. For now, here's what you need to know though. You must carry enough fuel to reach your intended destination, then fly to an alternate airport, then continue flying for an additional 45 minutes at normal cruise speed. If no alternate is required, you need to land at the destination with 45 minutes of fuel in reserve. That's what the FAA says. Now, this is what Jason says. I have something called the 3-hour rule, and it's a guideline I live by. Any team member here will tell you that we all fly by the 3-hour rule. From the moment I start the airplane to the moment I shut it down, I don't want that time to be greater than 3 hours. This is my hard set personal rule. Let's be honest too, it's tough to sit still in the cockpit for 3 hours at a stretch. You want to land, you want to get out, walk around, use the restroom, and most importantly, refuel the airplane after about 3 hours. So to adjust this for instrument flight, you want to factor in the time it takes to actually shoot approaches. You may want to plan the flight so that you begin the approaches at the 2.5 hour mark. That allows you to still land within that 3-hour window. This is where personal minimums and decision making meet. Let's say you're flight planning that you may see the airport you intend to land at. It's about 3 hours, 10 minutes away. What's another 10 minutes, you think? Well, you might be tempted to stretch that rule, but your airplane only holds 4 hours of fuel. So you plan the flight, but you find yourself now bucking a headwind, and that 3-hour, 10-minute flight turns into a 3-hour, 20-minute flight. You shoot the approach, and now you have to go missed. Can you imagine if you are in an unfamiliar area and you have to go missed? You're heading for an alternate. Maybe ATC gives you something unexpected. You're fumbling with your approach plates. You're trying to fly the airplane. You're trying to pull up frequencies for that airport you're being sent to, and wondering if your fuel is going to be enough to get to the alternate that ATC has now assigned for you. My suggestion, if you plan a flight greater than 3 hours, plan for a fuel stop at that halfway point. You never want to be that pilot who had to make an unscheduled off-airport landing because of fuel exhaustion. Again, the 3-hour rule is just Jason's rule, but for most of us who fly aircraft with 4 or 4.5 hours of fuel, from start to shutdown, I don't want that clock to say more than 3 hours, so I always know I have that reserve. I'll see you all in the next lesson. So when are you actually required to include an alternate on your flight plan? In any type of flying, as we discussed, VFR or IFR, it's a good idea to always have a plan of where to go if you can't get to your primary destination because of weather or some air traffic delay. When we fly under instrument flight rules, there are times when the FARs dictate we must file an alternate airport. Seriously, take notes here. I know we've mentioned this in some previous videos, just introduced it, but this is where I really want to make sure you fully understand it. I guarantee you'll see questions about this on your knowledge test and be asked about it on your check ride. The alternate rule is what some pilots call the 1-2-3 rule. The 1-2-3 rule states that the pilot must file for an alternate airport if the weather at the destination 1 hour before the intended time of arrival to 1 hour after the intended time of arrival, that's where we get the 1 in 1-2-3, there is a ceiling of less than 2,000 feet, that's where the 2 comes from in 1-2-3, and visibility of less than 3 statute miles. Now this information is going to have to come from looking at the TAF. If there's the possibility of weather, your destination falls into this category, you need to file an alternate airport. There are also rules on the airport you select as your alternate. The alternate airport also needs to meet the certain criteria, and here it is. When filing to an alternate airport that has a precision approach, that is an approach with a glide slope, the weather at the time of your arrival must be a ceiling of at least 600 feet and visibility of 2 statute miles. If the alternate airport has a non-precision approach, the weather minimums go up slightly. The weather at the time of arrival must be a ceiling of at least 800 feet and visibility of 2 miles. If there is no instrument approach at the alternate airport, the weather must be VFR at the time of landing, so a ceiling of at least 1,000 feet and visibility of at least 3 miles. If the airport you intend to go to doesn't have an instrument approach, but you are flying an IFR flight plan, let's say you're going to visit a friend who has a private airport, it's a grass runway, no IFR approach. It is a beautiful, clear day. But because there isn't a published IFR approach at your destination airport, the FARs state that you have to have an alternate, despite the 1-2-3 rule, just because there isn't an approach there. That's the 1-2-3 rule. Remember, 802 for non-precision, 602 for a precision approach. I guarantee you're going to be using this on this knowledge, not only on the knowledge test, not only a check ride, but also in your real world flying. So you definitely want to know and make sure you fully understand this, and I'll see you all in the next video. So as a VFR pilot, we learned that the altitudes we fly are dictated by the hemispheric rule for 91-159. That's 0 to 179 degrees. We fly at odd thousands plus 500 feet. The other side of the compass is evens plus 500 feet. The rule is adjusted for IFR flight. When we're in cruise flight on a heading of 0 to 179 degrees, odd altitude starting at 3,000 feet, so 3, 5, 7,000 feet, and so forth. There is no plus 500, that's VFR only now. The way to remember this, some instructors used to say, odd people live in the east, or west is best, as someone living on the east side of the country. You know, you kind of respect that a little bit, right? But either way, however you remember the rule, the other side of the compass, 180 to 359, we fly even altitudes, 4, 6, 8, etc. There is no plus 500. That 500-foot cushion we had is VFR pilots only. So keep that in mind. Also keep that in mind when ATC assigns you an altitude, you need to keep it. If your altitude starts to drift down, ATC will certainly let you know. You don't want to deviate from an altitude. Under IFR rules and IFR conditions, you may not see the other aircraft that's near you. So it's important that you hold the altitude that you are assigned here. The altitudes we're assigned depend in part on the routing we choose and a few other factors. These factors may include the minimum safe altitude on the route, the minimum reception altitude for the flight, if we're high enough to pick up the radio signals we need for navigation, minimum crossing altitudes for the route, and of course, the weather. As a VFR pilot, we had to avoid all those clouds, and your altitude was very much limited by the clouds. You either had to stay below or climb above them, which is never a great idea either. Now, with your instrument rating, flying through the cloud layer is actually an option. But how do we know what's inside the cloud? Is it a building cumulus cloud, this buildup? What really is it? There's going to be a lot of turbulence in that cloud, by the way, if it's that building cumulus cloud or cumulonimbus clouds. The clouds are going to just kind of keep on growing as you fly inside them. It's not going to be a very smooth flight. You may not be able to actually get up on top of some of these because they're going to continue to grow as well. You also always want to know where the freezing level is when choosing an altitude. Pay attention to the warnings such as icing possible in the clouds in precip. Stay out of that. Now that's how to select an altitude under IFR flight rules. In the next video, we're going to look at actually filling out our IFR navigation log. So in this lesson, we're going to learn how to fill in the navigation log. The IFR navigation log looks an awful lot like our VFR navigation log with one notable exception. Instead of using visual checkpoints to find your route, you're going on an IFR flight plan. It's a route by VORs, Victor Airways, GPS waypoints, and the like. And similar to how you do on a VFR flight, on IFR flights, you have to consider altitudes, winds, airspace, weather, all those things along the route. So for this exercise, we're going to plan a flight from Ocala, OCF, to Jacksonville's Executive Airport Craigfield, CRG. We're going to do both a paper nav log and then one electronically on ForeFlight. Here is the nav log you can download, by the way, and print out and kind of fill out along with this lesson if you wish. Even if you plan on doing all your flights digitally with ForeFlight or another app, you'll still need to know how to fill it out and interpret a paper nav log. There is a few questions about this on your knowledge test, and it's a good idea to know how to use a paper log and have one with you in the airplane just in case the technology you're using actually fails. The navlog can be the very same type of navlog you use for VFR flights. You will want to have one of each for these for the flight, the current VFR sectional chart and the low en route IFR chart. Both should be appropriate for the planned flight. They can either be a hard copy or digital. You want the VFR sectional chart because it has a lot of information on it that the low en route chart just simply doesn't have. Remember, the low en route chart is a different scale than a sectional chart. The low IFR en route chart covers about twice the territory as well of a VFR sectional chart. So you'll also want to have a current copy of the chart supplement book, either hard copy or digital, with you during the flight. Now that we have the tools we need, let's get started thinking about the route. I usually start with the preferred routes as listed in the chart supplement. You can find the preferred routes listed in the back. If you don't see the preferred route for that flight, I'm just going to plan the most direct route. This begins with the departure from the airport, and some airports, by the way, have departure procedures that you're required to follow. Let's review the takeoff minimums and obstacle departure procedures from Ocala. Now, these are listed in the approach binders, be it Jeppesen or the FAA printed charts. The departure procedure from Ocala, runway 8, has us climbing to a heading of 069 to 500 feet before proceeding on course. Now we can see there are obstacles off of runway 18, most notably trees. Runway 36 has taxiing aircraft within 43 feet of the departure end of the runway. Now that we've reviewed departure procedures, let's take a look at the routing. Let's start locating Ocala Airport here, and we need to head north towards Jacksonville. How should we get from here to there? Since there isn't a preferred route for this flight, I'm going to plan the most direct route using the low en route chart. Notice there is a VOR at Ocala. So we'll depart from Ocala using the VOR, and we'll proceed on Victor 441, which will take us to the Gainesville VOR, also known as the Gator VOR. Still continuing on Victor 441, we proceed to Bocap intersection, and then from there to the intersection Monia. We can now either go direct to Jacksonville International or proceed direct to an initial approach fix for the IFR approach we've chosen at Jacksonville. Here's my argument for always filing to an initial approach fix. Let's say you're about 10 minutes into the flight and you lose your radios. You're in the clouds, so you start squawking what? 7600 for radio failure. ATC has you as a primary target only. Now, filing to an initial approach fix protects that airspace and it belongs to you. When you get to the fix, you're in a position to actually shoot that approach. We'll go into details on lost comms in a future lesson though. Now, if you file to a particular fix, ATC will protect that fix and just wait for you to get there. So if we fill this flight plan from Ocala to Jacksonville and filing for the ILS 08 ending at Libby, that's what ATC is going to expect us to do. So now that we have a basic route, let's look at the altitudes we're going to fly. Getting out of Ocala, there is an MEA of 2,000 feet, followed by an MRA of 3,000 feet at Ledgeco. Can I get from my takeoff to 3,000 feet by the time I reach Ledgeco? Now, I would need to look at my performance chart to make sure it's possible. We'll be on a heading of 355, which puts us honestly at 4,000 feet on Victor 441 through Bocap intersection. And on this to then Monia, and then we'll kind of jaunt over to Libby, which is the initial approach fix for the approach that happens to be on Victor 198. Notice the altitude changes. We start out on a course of 355, then we get to 018. We're on the other side of the compass, and we need to fly at an odd altitude, which then takes us up, in this case, to 5,000 feet. Passing over Monia, we alter our course to 110, and finally 077, which takes us to Libby, and we're at Jacksonville International. Wind correction angles can get a little tricky on IFR flight plans as well. We still have to get our weather briefing and do our wind correction computations to get the wind correction angle and ground speed. Ground speed determines our time en route, just like we did for our VFR flight plans. Knowing the time en route is more important for IFR flight because when we're requesting, when we're on a flight plan, ATC is watching us and will ask us if we appear to be a lot slower or a lot faster than we actually filed. Because airspace in the IFR environment is a lot like a table in a restaurant. Someone else may want it if you're not using it or if you're taking longer than you thought as well. Distances, though, are a little bit easier because the legs are printed right on the low and route chart on the Victor Airways. As a VFR pilot, if I said I wanted my visual checkpoints no more than 10 or 15 miles apart tops, as an IFR pilot, that's not always possible, is it? Looking at the low and route chart, you see the distances printed along the Victor Airways are broken down fix to fix, VOR to VOR. It's really simple math to total them up. Now here comes the tricky part though. You plan your flight, you called ATC, you copied your clearance, they tell you to stand by. And they come back to you, they say those magic words, I have an amendment to your clearance. They're going to route you now all over the place, maybe due to weather, maybe due to traffic, and you have to plan a new route literally on the fly, no pun intended. This is where iPads now really shine because all you have to do is drag your finger and rubber band kind of to reroute yourself. Through the miracle of computer algorithms now, the computer calculates our new headings. This is where your diversion skills come in very handy as well, and situational awareness skills are certainly honed. You're expecting to take off runway 18 and they give you runway 26 and radar vectors. You need to account for the change of plans in your fuel burn. You need to know the fuel burn of your aircraft so you can keep tabs on your fuel consumption. If the radar vectors result in a longer flight especially, you need to be flexible to be an IFR pilot. You'll need to be prepared for changes, and as stated in FAR 91103, the pilot command has to be familiar with all available information prior to that flight. Let's take a look at what that means. For an IFR flight, we need to be familiar with the lengths of runways of intended use. We need to be familiar with the weather at our departure airport, the en route weather, and their forecast for our arrival. You should also know where the nearest VFR weather is just in case you ever get into a problem. You must be familiar with the fuel requirements for the flight, including how much fuel you need to have in reserve. You must be prepared to divert, especially here when you have an alternate plan of action should you not be able to complete the flight as planned. Practice creating flight plans, then practice changing them up. How do I quickly type in a new route? How do I find the intersections I need? Can I accept another approach? You have to do all these things literally on the fly and while flying the airplane, etc. And communicate with ATC and fly the airplane. It's all going to come with time here, so don't be discouraged. I hope you enjoy this lesson, and I'll see you all in the next video. So let's wrap up IFR flight plan now with a quick review. I want to emphasize that even though you intend to fly on an IFR flight plan, you still need to have a current VFR sectional chart, maybe even a TAC chart, either a hard copy or an electronic copy with you in the cockpit, along of course with our IFR approach plates and low en route charts. You still need to get a weather briefing, paying special attention to freezing levels because they're going to be key in determining your en-route altitudes. And you know you may plan this beautiful IFR flight plan, but you may not get the one you actually file for. ATC is very good at making changes when reading back or when giving you back your clearance. So double check what you put in or what they put you in won't put you in icing conditions, and that your aircraft is capable to do what ATC is asking of you for the safety of that flight. Double check then the fuel requirements. These are still based on ground speed and time in the air. Are you able to complete it in time based on what you planned and based on now what they gave you? Are you able to fly to that alternate airport, then an additional 45 minutes at normal cruising speed? And you should always be prepared to divert to that alternate. There are times when we're required by regulation. Remember this. It's the 1-2-3 rule. The 1-2-3 rule states that the pilot must file for an alternate airport if the weather at the destination 1 hour before the intended time of arrival to 1 hour after the intended time of arrival is a ceiling of less than 2,000 feet and visibility of less than 3 statute miles. Now, filing an alternate is always good practice. We know that, yes, the FARs require it. We know that, but we can do that even when it's not required. I like to have that. And you can do so by looking at the TAF to see when you're required to versus when it's just a best idea to. Alternate airport selection is also outlined by the FARs, and it's based on what type of approach we intend to do and the weather at that airport. When filing to an alternate airport that has a precision approach, that's an approach with a glide slope, the weather at your time of arrival must be a ceiling of at least 600 feet and visibility of 2 statute miles. If the alternate airport has a non-precision approach, the weather at the time of the arrival must be a ceiling of at least 800 feet and visibility of 2 miles. If the alternate airport does not have a published instrument approach, the weather at the time of landing must be a ceiling of at least 1,000 feet and visibility of 3 miles. Now let's go ahead and review our cruising altitudes. Now, you're going to pick your altitude on your IFR low en route chart, noting the minimum en route altitudes for obstruction clearance, minimum reception altitudes. Instrument flying is all about electronic means of navigation, VOR, GPS. If they can't get good signals, you're literally flying blind in the clouds. So under IFR flight rules, when in cruise flight on a heading of 0 to 179 degrees, you should fly at odd altitudes starting at 3,000 feet, so 3, 5, 7. So forth. On the other side of the compass, you fly even altitudes, so starting 4, 6, etc. Those other factors that determine the routing should include your minimum en route altitude. That should give you adequate signal coverage and terrain avoidance. Your minimum safe altitudes, don't go any lower than that. My minimum reception altitudes, which go as low as they can go to pick up the radio signals. And then minimum crossing altitudes, which we'll see when we have a higher MEA coming up. An IFR navlog, by the way, can be filled out, we learned, on paper or digitally with ForeFlight or another app. For your knowledge test, you will need to know how to fill out and interpret a paper navlog. And frankly, it's a good idea to have a paper copy in the aircraft with you just in case the technology you're using fails. This navlog can be the same type of navlog you use for your VFR flights. Many pilots start actually with the VFR navlog, then transfer the information over to an IFR navlog because it really helps with situational awareness. Begin by referencing a VFR sectional chart, an IFR low en route chart, and a current copy of the US chart supplement. Again, These can be hard copy or digital copies of that. Now, you'll want a VFR sectional chart because it has a lot of information that we just don't get on the IFR low and route charts. There's a reason the sectional chart's so colorful and the low and route's just kind of black and white with the exception of a few colors for airports in there. Remember, the IFR low and route, though, is in a different scale than the sectional chart. So if you're measuring, make sure you're using the appropriate scale for each. Also remember, preferred IFR routes, they're listed in the back of the US chart supplement. If you don't see a preferred route for the flight, pick a route that works for you, beginning with the departure of the airport, and note if the airport has a departure procedure. Now you may see this one actually on your knowledge test. Let's review the takeoff minimums and obstacle departure procedures from Grand Junction, Colorado. These departures listed in the approach binders, be it Jeppesen or the FAA printed charts. The departure procedure from Grand Junction runway 11 has us climbing to a heading of 112 to an altitude of 6,000 feet. Then executing a climbing right turn to the JNC VOR DME, thence we would fly whichever transition we had been assigned. Note that there are some obstacles near the runways that we need to be aware of during the takeoff, notably a pole that sits at 252 feet from the departure end of the runway and is 20 feet above ground level. So the required performance for your aircraft, such as 300 feet per nautical mile until you reach 9,300, is also noted in the departure. The purpose of the departure procedure is to get the aircraft up and away from obstacles in a quick manner. Just really get you in the en-route structure faster, meaning on a course or on a Victor airway or highways in the sky. The Victor airways, by the way, on your low and route chart extend from VOR to VOR. We see the Billings Livingston and Bozeman VORs. You see them? All connected by Victor Airways. Billings to Livingston, Victor 2 or Victor 86, which extends for a total of 77 miles, with the mileage breakdowns in the smaller boxes. Note too the altitude restrictions. When we head east, we need to be at 7,000 feet. West, 9,700. The triangles mark fixes. Again, who makes up these names, but they're Nauru, Colas, Repo, and Subkey, I believe is how you pronounce those. Sorry if you're flying in that area and I got those all wrong, but who gets to name these intersections? I don't know. But again, Jason fits perfectly for one. If you were planning this flight, though, and you're put on your nav log, you would use those fixes in there as you're planning to help define that route. If Livingston, Montana is our destination, it would behoove us to take a look at the available approaches into Livingston and check them against the NOTAMs for the airport to make sure we have the equipment we need, it's still in service. When you file to a flight plan, file to an initial approach fix for that approach. Filing to an initial approach fix is good practice in the event you lose your radios, known as lost comms. In the IFR world, and you're in the clouds, that's an emergency. I'd put in the transponder 7600, assume my transponder is working, let ATC know I have a radio failure through that 7600. They're going to keep the airport open, and they're going to know where I'm going. I'm going to this initial approach fix. Make sure, too, you compute your time en route for that IFR flight plan. Not only is it imperative for our fuel burn calculations, but ATCs can need to know approximately how long will it take for you to arrive at your destination, because there's likely another aircraft that wants to use probably that same approach. So ATCs be sure that you are out of the way before they clear another aircraft through your location. You create your route, you filed your flight plan, you determine the time en route, the fuel burn, and now you're ready to copy your clearance. Save yourself some time by using our acronym of CRAFT. The C is cleared to, as in cleared to the airport via this initial approach fix, followed by our routing. I just want to hear the words as filed, I'm being honest with you. It means fly what you file. If you get radar vectors, it means the controller's been given headings for you to fly. Altitude, this is the initial altitude of the flight because you'll have multiple altitudes along the way. F is our frequency. Who am I going to be talking to? Approach, center, and then, of course, the code for that. And lastly, the T is our transponder squawk code that we need to squawk. Write it all down, and if you miss something, of course, ask the controller to say again. It's a pilot talk, right, for saying, I didn't hear you, can you say it back? All we want to hear, though, is read back correct. Is what we really want to hear with that. FAR 91-103 required pre-flight action states the pilot command must be familiar with all available information prior to the flight. So you worked with this as a private pilot. Now it becomes extra important as an instrument pilot. You need to know what your options are for refueling en route, your altitudes, your actual routing, navigational frequencies. Are they in use? They out of service? What about known ATC delays, traffic delays, airspace changes, the freezing level, winds aloft, weather en route at the destination? Hey, where's the nearest VFR weather? It's one of the most important things you can know, just in case you ever get into a problem. Remember, having an instrument rating gives you the option of launching weather that is below VFR minimums. That doesn't mean you should take off though. And always leave yourself an out, or better yet, at least 2 outs, just in case the flight doesn't go as planned. So anyways, after this, there is just a quick little, I don't even want to call it a quiz anymore. It's just a great little review to kind of further solidify the information we've been learning all throughout this lesson. So take action on that. Don't hesitate to reach out with any questions.